Well, let's begin with a little review. And we talked about a lot of things last week. Might have been overload, I don't know. But we'll try to review that and be as clear as we can about it. So the questions on your lesson sheet there are, what does it mean to be holy? And the choices are, you live a sinful life, no slip-ups, letter B. You are set apart, sanctified, consecrated, letter C. You are better than everyone else. All right, letter B. Now, if you lived a sinless life and there were no slip-ups, would you be holy? I think so. What's the problem there, though? None of us does that, okay? So that's why A doesn't qualify. So we have to rely upon God to enable us to become holy and to be in such a state that we can serve Him. And that was certainly true of the Israelites. And as you think of them, I'm thinking back to Exodus 19. Let me go back there. Verses 5 and 6 is where Israel, as a nation, as a people, accepts the terms that God sets before them in this covenant. But what He says is, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So He's choosing them to be holy. And so all that we're reading about and all that we're looking at has to do with how it is that they can be holy, despite the fact that they, like us, have sinned. All right, number 2, what did the tabernacle declare? God's desire to dwell with man, the reminder of sinful man's exclusion from God, and then letter C was both A and B, and letter D was neither A nor B. So what'd you get for this one? All right, letter C is the correct choice, both A and B. Now tell me what that means. God's desire to dwell with man, reminder of sinful man's exclusion from God. Couldn't have full access to God. Okay, very good. So we talked about this tabernacle and God's presence said to dwell there. And so on the one hand, you've got God's presence right in the middle of the camp, right there where everybody can see it. And yet, on the other hand, you can't just barge in there in His presence. And so it's very limited, and the access is limited to a very great extent. And all these sacrifices we'll be looking at tonight had to do with allowing someone to be in a holy condition, and not necessarily to enter into the most holy place, but just to be a part of this nation. So, when we think about Exodus and all that instruction about the tabernacle, chapters 25 to 40, that all has to do with this, which has to do with the people being in the right condition as far as being acceptable to God. All right, what about these statements? Which would you say is true? Something common or unclean could be sacrificed to God. Defilement from leprosy, mold, or a dead body was a moral sin. Ritual impurity, giving birth to a child, for instance, often required cleansing by sacrifice. And letter D, the priest could never be impure. Okay, I heard a B. No, I probably didn't hear a B. Which one is it here? Letter C. Okay. So, what's wrong with letter A? Pardon me? Unblemished. Okay? So it couldn't be unclean and offered to God. So it had to be clean, and there were things that were common that could be either clean or unclean. So anything offered to God had to be clean, had to be acceptable. If it had been defiled, It had to be made clean and made acceptable to him. What about letter B? What's wrong with that one? Not moral. Okay. So there are things that God said makes one unholy or defiled, and they're not necessarily moral sins. They're not sins where you do something against someone else. It's just in a ritual way, you are considered to be unclean. And then what about letter D? Why would that not fit? The priest could be impure. The priest could sin. And one of the best examples is right there in Leviticus 10, when Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron, offer a strange fire, and God kills them. He takes care of them right then and there. Okay, so that's our review. And we looked at this last time, and this is, kind of involved here, but let's just think of this being acceptable before God. And all these things that relate to this, I think, would certainly make someone conscious of it on an ongoing basis. So we said there a moment ago that there was something that would be considered clean. Something that's common would be for ordinary use. And so take an animal, for instance. You might have an animal and you're going to offer it to God. Well, it should be something that's clean versus something that's unclean. And there were other things that were clean that it was all right to do, all right to use. The moral there is a little bit misleading because it's not necessarily something that's moral or immoral. But if something was moral and you were doing that thing, then it would be considered clean. On the other hand, you've got this other category up here, unholy. And so something unclean could be unclean by virtue of God saying it's unclean. And what example did we cite? You could probably think of others. Chapter 11 of Leviticus talks about what kinds of clean and unclean. Animals, okay. Not that you'd know Leviticus 11, but it's the very next chapter there where God says, okay, here are clean animals, you can eat those. Here are unclean animals, you can't eat those. And so the unclean would be defiled. So it might be defiled by virtue of God saying that it was. I suppose in that sense, I'm not sure where that one fits, ritual or immoral. I don't know that it's immoral, but I'm not sure it fits this ritual description. At any rate, maybe it does, because that's what we're saying about mold in a house or leprosy. Some of the things God deemed as being unclean, therefore defiled. Therefore, it has to be cleansed or sanctified. Now, there were some things where there was no sacrifice to be offered for it, and so God brings judgment upon someone. Some of the judgments were, you're to be stoned if that happens. That doesn't mean that the people carried it out in every instance, but that was his command. And to be unclean had some repercussions. You might be excluded from the community and then unable to worship at God's sanctuary until you were cleansed. And here's something about the law that it may be we don't fully appreciate like we would have had we been a part of Israel. This was kind of a collective religion, by which I mean you could do something that would affect the entire group. Now, it certainly would affect you, but your uncleanness could actually affect a lot of other people. Well, is that true for us today? For instance, the case of leprosy, if you had leprosy and you stayed among the people, then not only are you unclean, but you're causing others, if they touch you, for instance, to be unclean. Okay, so that's probably one of the reasons why God said, okay, you go out here until you're clean and can be back with the group. What about us today? Does our sin affect others in our community? Okay. 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 And maybe in the same way that we were saying last time, one of the applications we were making of this, when you get to the New Testament, God's made this distinction clear, and then the New Testament really focuses upon, well, not just exclusively the inward man. It's not like the inward man God's concerned with, and he's not concerned about the outward man, but he's concerned about a holiness that begins with our spirits and our hearts, and then exhibits itself in an outward way. So maybe in the same way, our sin certainly affects us, but it can affect others. And there are certainly instances in the New Testament where if a church, Corinth, had somebody among them that was living immorally, they were to do something about that because of the effect that it might have upon them. But here's a situation where somebody might be ritually unclean and just, everybody else being around them, they become unclean. And so there's really an effect that it's having. Okay, exactly right. Okay. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is being sanctified, becoming clean as opposed to unclean, being in a pure state by which you're acceptable to God. You can enter in and offer sacrifices. Of course, that's the very need on the part of the people, is to go to the priest and offer the sacrifice, but to be in communion with God. And we'll talk about that a little bit tonight with these sacrifices. Now, does that clear up every question about what the Israelites did? Not in my mind, by any means. And one of the questions is, like even as you read through this instruction manual of Leviticus, okay, this sacrifice, do this, and I wonder, well, how did they know when to do that? And how often to do that? And exactly how did they go about it? And I think the answer is, or at least part of the answer is, they did with God's word what we do with God's word. They read it and they tried to make application of it just like we make application today. So I don't know that we know all the answers to those questions. They were given instruction and then they were to carry those out. All right, so let's look at Leviticus, and we're not going to spend the entire quarter on Leviticus. We're going to spend a few lessons here at the outset on it. As I said last time, if you look at a book, you often look at the table of contents because you want to see, okay, where's this going? What's this encompass? Well, you can do that with the book of Leviticus. Here's one way of outlining the book. I'm sure there are others. So chapters 1 to 7, which we'll look at this evening, rituals and sacrifices. Then the ordaining of the priests. So the tabernacle has been constructed. Aaron's family has been chosen to serve as priests among the tribe of Levi, but they've got to be consecrated to do that service, and that's what chapters 8 to 10 are about. Then we have some instruction about ritual purity in chapters 11 to 15, and then in the middle of the book, chapters 16 and 17, there is a lengthy description of the Day of Atonement. Okay, so we'll look at that when we get to it, not this evening. Then there's teaching on moral purity. So chapters 18 to 20 deal with a lot of particulars, and we'll have an opportunity to look at that in a couple of weeks' time. And then look at chapters 21 and 22, the qualifications for priests. And some are disqualified on the basis of some physical things that they probably can't control, and yet God gave those restrictions. And then finally, we've got the feast days in chapters 23 to 25. We're going to look at those this evening. Now, here is something that's helpful to know, and I think it's helpful in looking at Leviticus. It's possibly, I think there's a strong indication that this is how the book was laid out. There is a Greek letter called either chi or chi. I meant to look that up. I've heard chi and chiastic, but I've heard chi and chiastic. Okay, what's that all about? Here's the Greek letter. Well, the reason that you have a structure that's referred to as chiastic comes from this letter chi. Looks like our letter X, doesn't it? Okay, and how many strokes does it take to make the letter chi? 2. Okay, one here and then one like that, just like our X would be. Well, based on that, notice that you've got 2 ends of the letter that are similar, and then the other 2 ends are similar. But notice if you go across the top and then the bottom, you've got this kind of order. You've got A, and then B is the other side. And then if you come down to the bottom, what's the next one in order? It's B, okay? The other end of the B at the top, and then likewise the A there. So A, B, B, A. Instead of A, B, C, D, whatever. All right, so notice what happens here. Something's written down in chiastic form, and what the writer does is he puts a point, and then he puts another point, and sometimes in Hebrew poetry, parallelism, Psalms, Proverbs, what he does is he puts a point and another point, and then he puts that point again, and then he puts the first point last. Okay? Does that make any sense? That's not how we do it. We start at the beginning and we go to the end. All right, let's see how that works with Leviticus. And you can probably already see the pattern there. And it doesn't have to just be 2. It could be 3. It could be 5. All right? If you look at kind of what matches there, you've got rituals at the top and the bottom. You've got priesthood, the second point, and then you've got things that concern purity, are the third indented point, and then you've got the Day of Atonement right in the middle. So, if we just kind of enlarge the similarities there, notice this chiastic structure, if in fact that's what this is. You've got things that match each other, not that they're identical, but that they're similar. So the very first and the very last things have to do with some rituals that relate to sacrifices in the opening chapters, feast days at the end of the book. And then you've got priests, and then you've got things concerning purity, and then the Day of Atonement. So if you put those letters up there, and this is what Rick was talking about Sunday night, that A prime is supposed to be next to the A, not below it. B and B prime, C and C prime, D. So what seems to be the most important in all of that? If you're going to pick out something that was really being emphasized, what do you think? Whatever's in the middle. Okay? And I really think that that Day of Atonement is really at the middle of all that surrounds this. And then chapter 17 talks about blood, the importance of blood. You know, the life is in the blood. So I think by the very structure, there is a suggestion of how things are ordered and then how things are emphasized. But if nothing else, it might just help us, instead of opening up 27 chapters and saying, man, you know, where's this thing going? Well, there is kind of a symmetry to it. There is a balance. There is a purpose. And I'm going to give God full credit for that. I don't think that's the invention of some person somewhere. I think that's how the ancients wrote many times, and the Holy Spirit is able to use that. And why might you use this kind of a structure, among other things? Can you think of a reason why you might make some things match as you get to the middle there? Yeah, Ian? Repetition, good. If you were primarily getting this information by listening instead of by reading, which is the way most people did it back then, most people did not read, and reading materials were not as prevalent as they are today. The hearing is important, and if you hear something in a certain order, it can aid in learning it, and it's being repeated. So that's a possibility. It's a very strong possibility. All right, so enough about that. That's just to say there's a certain order here. And so what we're going to look at this evening are the first and the last, the ritual sacrifices and the ritual feast days. So let's start with the sacrifices in chapters 1 to 7. And a lot of detail here. We're not going to go through all the detail. But what we've got on the lesson sheet there are some general ideas about the different sacrifices and why they were made. So there is a burnt offering, there is a meal offering, and there is a drink offering. And sometimes that meal and drink offering are offered with other sacrifices. The burnt offering, when it was offered, the animal was burned completely. I mean, just consumed completely by the fire. And the suggestion here is that this suggests a certain commitment to God. Somebody offering this sacrifice is expressing that they're committed to doing what God wants them to do. So how often was this offered? We're not told. You know, does the average Israelite do one of these a year or a couple of these? Now, sometimes they're prescribed with other things, but instruction is given there, and almost all of these, the meal and the drink offering would be the exception, involve an animal. And an animal that's without blemish, that's being offered to God and serves a purpose there. All right, the second one there, what we might call a fellowship or peace offering. And as you might guess, what's the idea of this offering? If the offerer is making this kind of a peace offering, what's the desire? Yeah, relationship, communion with God. So we talk about taking communion. What are we doing? Well, we're sharing in something. We're partaking of it. And so that's the idea of this particular offering. And I think this is one of the offerings, or at least an offering where some of the animal was burned and then some was given to the priests and eaten. So it maybe lends itself to kind of a eating of a meal type situation. And then there is the sin and the guilt offering, and these are closely related. And what do they have to do with? Yeah. Okay, so 3 C's there: commitment, communion, cleansing. And so some of those sin and guilt offerings there have to do with, if you've done this to someone and you've done this kind of damage, then you need to restore that. But in addition to that, you need to offer something to God. And so an attempt is being made to make things right as far as God is concerned. All right, comments that you have about any of that? I mean, that's a very brief survey of those 7 chapters, and that's simplifying it to a large extent. But at least that gives us an idea of what's taking place there. And so often with these feast days, for instance, some of these offerings would be prescribed by God, that when you have this feast, you do this, and you offer this kind of animal or this kind of offering. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. And again, how often are people doing this? I mean, they're certainly doing it on the feast days, like the Passover. That's something that's commanded. But some of these would be the prerogative of the worshiper. So we're not necessarily told unless we're told somebody offered this animal when they did this action or that action. All right, so here's a picture of the altar out in front of the tabernacle on which an animal whose life had been taken from it was then offered upon that altar. Now again, when we're talking about ritual, what we mean is something that's done. There's a certain action, but that action is sort of symbolic of something. Like you sprinkle blood on something. Well, does sprinkling blood on something make that thing, does that cleanse the sin? No. But it's symbolic of blood is being shed and is necessary in order for there to be remission of sin. Okay? Well, let's turn the page, well, before we do that. So here are some New Testament allusions to Old Testament sacrifice. I mean, why bother with this? Well, look at some of these passages. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Paul says we're to be what kind of a sacrifice? Living sacrifice, okay? So that's kind of generic, but interesting, isn't it? That he's suggesting, they have an understanding of what a sacrifice is. All right, 1 Peter 1 and verse 19. A lamb without, anybody remember? You didn't have these in your lesson, so we're just freelancing it here. A lamb without, spot or blemish or spot. Okay, and then there are some here. John 10:17, Jesus makes a statement. Paul says Romans 5:19. We just studied Hebrews 10. Listen to Jesus' statement, 10:17. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I might take it up again. Well, that could have to do with somebody's, going to offer their life, but in the context of a sacrifice, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Romans 5:19, for as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience, that is his sacrifice of himself, the many will be made righteous. Hebrews 10:10, by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Now we take it for granted, sure, okay, he's offering himself. Well, you understand that if you understand Leviticus. Makes perfect sense. And suggestive, I think, among other things, of dedication. Ephesians 5 and verse 2, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Okay, so think about that drink offering or meal offering. The idea of what's being offered has a certain fragrance to it. And so Jesus' offering is sweet smelling. Similarly, Philippians 4:18, Paul writes and says, I've received full payment. He's saying, you've helped me, you Philippians, and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. So that makes sense in light of understanding the Old Testament. 2 Corinthians 5:20 and 21, Paul says in verse 21, for our sake, he, God, made him, Christ, he doesn't say that in the verse, he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. He made him to be sin. Well, I thought Jesus didn't sin. Okay? And really you could almost supply sin offering. He became sin. He became this offering for sin by his death on the cross. And then finally, Hebrews 13:11 and 12, the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. Well, that relates to some of these sacrifices made, and the rest of the animal is taken outside the camp. So the point being that understanding these sacrifices helps us understand teaching in the New Testament. All right, let's look at the other side of the ledger here. The last few chapters, with the exception of 26 and 27. So let's think about the feast days, okay? And I always used to think, you'd read something about a feast day, or you go back to the Old Testament like we're doing, and you read about those feast days, and again, it's just like this, all this stuff they're supposed to be doing. It's so confusing. Well, actually, it's not really all that confusing. Okay, so let's look at them. The Sabbath day was a weekly observance, once every seventh day, a day of rest, okay? But more, what else was there to the Sabbath? Yes, a day of rest, okay? You don't have to go to work today. So I'm going to just lounge around, watch some TV, take in a game or two, and boy, it's just going to be a relaxing day. Is that the idea of the Sabbath? What did it really have to do with, in addition to cessation of work? Let me ask this question. What were the Jews doing in the time of Jesus on the Sabbath? They were resting, but they were also doing what? Going to the synagogue to do what? Read from Scripture, learn, instruction. So it's really intended by God to be a time of focus on fellowship with God. Yes, you're not working, but it's not secular in nature. It's very spiritual in nature. A time and opportunity to focus upon God. All right, Passover, first month, 14th day. And we've looked at this recently. Commemorates the deliverance that Israel had received. A lamb was to be slain and its blood put on the doorposts. So there's the blood spread on the doorposts. And they would eat a meal together and remember this. And God says, you're to teach your children when they ask about this. All right, unleavened bread. What did that have to do with? Do you remember? Where's this one fit in? It's actually kind of related to Passover. How? Yeah. Unleavened bread. How's that relate to Passover? They didn't put any leaven in the bread. In fact, they were to get rid of the leaven, and this kind of commemorates that. And all that has to do with sort of a hasty departure because God brought it about all of a sudden. It wasn't like some long, protracted negotiations. I mean, there were the plagues, and that was, in a sense, negotiating, but Pharaoh didn't give in until he finally just said go, and they left, and they went. And so this unleavened bread you can see there is right on the end of the Passover. So you often read about those two together, the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. One followed the other. All right, for 7 days, no leaven. And it commemorates what they had done. Now this one's interesting. First fruits, it says the first Sabbath after Passover. I used to think of Pentecost as kind of being the first fruits, and there's a sense in which it is. But apparently this is a day when the first fruits of the crops are being offered to God, like a wave offering and some other things. It's sort of like saying, okay, this belongs to you. All right, promise of things to come. First day, the first Sabbath after the Passover. Wave offering, a barley sheaf, burnt offering, meal and drink offering. That's where we said some of these combine these things together. All right, then Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover. So you've got 7 weeks and then a day. And Pentecost, also referred to as the Feast of Weeks. So 7 weeks after that first fruits. In the New Testament, it's called Pentecost. And again, I think this was about the time where the grains would be harvested. And so this was being offered to God as a result of his having blessed them in terms of what they had received. Well, on the 7th month, the first day, there was, I don't know if it's called a Feast of Trumpets. Yeah, it is. And among other things, trumpets could be used for several purposes. Calling people together, announcing that they were going to war, or announcing some kind of special gathering or occasion. Okay? And then the Day of Atonement, the 7th month, the 10th day. And what happens on that day? Basically, what's going on the Day of Atonement? It's the only day on which God actually said to the people, you're to afflict yourselves, meaning you're to fast. You're not to eat on the Day of Atonement. All the other fasts that came along with things resulted from tradition, really. What happens on the Day of Atonement? Okay, atonement is going to be made for the people and for who else? Which is included in the people, but is actually a little separate. For the high priest. Because the high priest is going to go into God's presence, the most holy place, and make atonement. Which says something about these sacrifices. If sacrifices are being offered for sin throughout the year, why do you have to go in once a year and make atonement for everything? Because that blood, really in a sense, doesn't accomplish fully what Christ's blood will accomplish. Ian? Yes. Okay. Yeah. If you understand the Day of Atonement, among other things, it just makes all that language in Hebrews so meaningful. Draw near, we have access, when previously, no, not everyone could go in there and do that. That's exactly right. All right, so he enters the most holy place, makes atonement, 2 goats, 1 sacrifice, 1 release. Okay, not sure about what's wrong with our bottom slide here. Tabernacles, 7th month for a whole week. What did that memorialize? Do you remember? Booths, tabernacles. Yeah, the time that they spent in the wilderness. Okay? So, they remember that God had brought them out of Egypt and then cared for them in the wilderness and finally brought them into the promised land. And it also had to do with like grape harvest and other things. So there were other crops that were being brought in at that time. All right, real quickly, look at what you've got here. Now that all sounds really complicated, and I don't know why this lettering is off, but really what you've got, here's our calendar. There's the Jewish calendar. And so their year religiously started over here on the right, Nisan, N-I-S-A-N. And that commemorates when they left Egypt. It would be as if we said July 4th is going to be the start of our year. We don't do that, do we? Our year starts on January 1st. But what they said was, we left Egypt on this date, and so 14 days after that, we're going to offer the Passover lamb. And then the next day is that's the unleavened bread. I'm thinking of the first fruits. Okay? And then Pentecost. So all I'm saying is when you look at this, it's really not all that complicated. You've got 3 things right there close together, and then Pentecost 50 days after. Okay? And then you go over to the other side to the 7th month. Half a year later, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. First month, seventh month. All right? Well, all of this is intended to do what? Make life complicated for the Israelites? No. What's God trying to do for them? You remember this relationship that we have together. All right. I'm going to just go through this because we're almost out of time. References to these feasts in the New Testament. So again, knowing a little bit about them is helpful. Let's look last of all at the year of Jubilee, not the day of Jubilee. Okay. So how often does the year of Jubilee come about? Anybody know? Every 50 years, okay? So you take 7 cycles of 7 years, and then the next year, okay, here we go, formatting's off. 50th year. Every 50 years, what's going to happen? If you're in debt, your debt's forgiven. If you're a slave, you can go free if you want to. Liberty will be proclaimed. Property returned back to its owner. Why would God have done that? What did they do when they went into the land? They divided up the land and everybody got some. Well, if you sold it for some reason, every 50th year, about once a lifetime, you've got a chance to reacquire it. Slaves released. And all of that, if you look at what Jesus reads in Luke chapter 4, I think he's alluding in part to the year of Jubilee, but he's saying there's going to be spiritual freedom that comes, not just physical freedom. All right, so there's the year of Jubilee. So here are all these feast days that God has his people keep, and they're reminders of his goodness toward them, of things that have happened in their past, but they're all pointing forward to the coming of Jesus. Okay? So I think that takes us to about where we need to be. So next time we're going to look at the priests. So chapters 8 to 10, chapters 21 and 22. And we're not going to have time for these questions. So we'll take those chapters next time.